As I said, the Civil War was the single greatest event in the history of this country, before or after. There's just absolutely no question. It changed who we were as a people. It was a tectonic shift in values and self-image. Prior to the war, people largely identified themselves as being from a particular state. I'm a Missourian, or I'm a Kentuckian, or I'm a New Yorker, or I'm a Virginian. And it was more or less, yes, I'm from the United States of America, but their chief identity was to their state. Sort of like the European Union is in a way today. Let's hope they don't go through anything like this. But they would consider themselves European in a broad sense, but mostly French, or mostly, no, I'm a German who happens to belong to the European Union. And oh, yes, I support the European Union. Sure, sure, yeah, absolutely. But I'm a German first. And that really changed a lot. Now, it changed in modern times because we move around a lot, and there are more and more people who live in different places all over the country. But we've become a much more homogenized country as a result of the Civil War. Just to give you one little important change that kind of seems like it's a kind of a minimal thing at first, but when you think about it, it's really profound. Prior to the Civil War, people used to say the United States of America are a country. Now we don't say that. We say the United States of America is a country. That shift, just in the to be verb there, is a huge change in the way we think of ourselves. We think of ourselves first now as Americans who happen to be from Texas, who happen to be from California, who happen to be from Minnesota. And we find our regional identities to sometimes be the subject of quaint jokes as opposed to we're Americans. If you don't believe this, travel overseas with Americans from all over the country. They stick together. They hang out together. Doesn't matter what their color, doesn't matter what their ethnicity or background or religion is. If they get identified, if you're on a cruise ship or if you're on a tour someplace and you meet up with an American and you can tell by their voice, or you can tell by the way they walk or talk or dress, Americans immediately start sidling over to each other. We walk up to each other and say, hey, where are you from? There's an identity there that doesn't exist among Europeans. They don't. I mean, Germans would do that with Germans, but they wouldn't do it with French people. So it really changed the way we viewed ourselves. We're now one country. And oh, by the way, after the war, one of the ways that the nation sort of psychologically bound up the wounds, as Abraham Lincoln will say, was to sort of find this mutual ground of respect. If you look at all of the things that were written after the war by, say, Civil War veterans, North and South, one of the things that happens is that there's an acknowledgement by the South that it was a good thing. Southern writers, it was a good thing that the nation was preserved and that slavery ended, right? Aside from a few cuckoos. But for the most part, most Southern writers right after the war, and even the second generation after the war, write to the extent of, well, it was sad that there was such suffering, and it was sad that there was such loss, but in the end, we are one country, and that's a good thing. And we ended slavery, and that's a good thing. Because remember, even Jefferson said it was like having a wolf by the ears, slavery was. You don't want to hang on, but you don't dare let go of it, because it's an institution that's an evil institution, but what are we going to do? How are we going to get rid of it unless we do it wholesale, right? Well, the war certainly did that. It got rid of it wholesale with a lot of suffering, but it did it. And so Southern writers especially say it's good that we're one country instead of two. We would never have made a go of it. It wouldn't have been a good thing for us to be our own country anyway. And the North sort of makes nice, a little sort of political, historical kissy face going on. You always see references to, well, we didn't like their cause of secession, but we always respected them as people who were brave and valiant and chivalrous and people who fought bravely, and we have to admire their great character, their great bravery in battle. And so, a little of that was forced. A little of that might be a little historical revisionism, but at the same time, it was a way after the war for North and South to kind of heal this divide. That was very important. All the propaganda after the war was, we must heal the divide. We must heal the divide. Because once the North won essentially what amounts to a war of conquest, and it was, it had to find a way to make sure that the Union didn't just get preserved at the end of a muzzle, but that it was preserved psychologically among the minds and hearts of the people of the South. It's an interesting thing. The tactics that eventually had to be used in the war were quite brutal, quite harsh. At the beginning of the war, everybody, North and South, thought this will be over in a matter of weeks. Believe it or not, they really thought so. And, the South thought, why, we can whip Yankees and they'll start running and they'll leave us alone and we'll have our own country. And the North thought, these people have no clue. These are a bunch of tobacco chewing, peanut eating rednecks. We'll go down there and whip them really easily because we got all this military might and all this industrial might, and it'll be easy. The one guy who really understood what was going to happen, and that is William Tecumseh Sherman, told everybody he knew, because he lived in the South, grew up, was born in Ohio, lived in the South, a military person by career, said this is going to be a long and horrible, nightmarish, bloody battle, and I don't know when it's going to end. His friends literally almost had him committed to an insane asylum for making those kinds of statements. They thought he was insane for thinking the war would go on more than a month or so. And he turned out to be absolutely correct. And the irony, of course, is that it is Sherman who is the one who understood that what you had to do to win this war was to give the South such a terrible taste of the devastation, destruction, and trauma that war can inflict that, as he said, they may not love us, but they'll think long and hard before ever trying to secede again. And he was right. He'd lived in the South and he knew the South. He knew that they weren't going to quit and he knew they weren't going to give up. It had to be a war of conquest. The South had a lot of military disadvantages, but it had a tremendously talented leadership corps in Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and Jubal Early and Ewell and Johnston and all these wonderful commanders. The North had a leadership vacuum, but it had a lot of war materiel. It had industrial might. That's the thing that really prolonged it. The South didn't have stuff, but it had talented people. The North had stuff, but no talented people. So the thing raged on tremendously. I want you to think for a moment, especially, what a traumatic experience it must have been to go out your front door in any given town in the U.S., South mostly, but also in the North, and see dead bodies strewn across your yard, to see that in your hometown whole generations of young men had been wiped out in battle. There were towns, for example, after the Civil War that had no young men left. They were all gone. They were all dead. The carnage was extreme. More people in the Battle of Antietam there were more casualties in Antietam in one day than there were in the entire Vietnam conflict. That is huge. What to do with, just practical questions, what to do with all the dead bodies? There were stacks and piles of dead animals after the Battle of Gettysburg, and they had to cremate them. And for 3 years, people could still not get the smell of the stench out of their drapes and their clothes and their blankets. It was an unbelievably traumatic experience for the nation as a whole. They'd never seen anything like this. War was something that was a distant memory. The Revolution didn't have anything like this kind of carnage. And it went on and on and on and on. The Battle of Shiloh had more casualties than the Battle of Waterloo. And after the Battle of Shiloh, there were another 15 battles just like it, with as many casualties. It was a tremendous bloodbath. And it was played out in people's front yards. Everyone knew people who had died. Everyone knew people who had been terribly traumatically injured and altered. Just an amazingly devastating experience. And to add to that, the invention of photography had happened a couple of decades before, and the newspapers didn't just tell you the stories. You could go by Matthew Brady's studios in Washington or in Baltimore or New York, and you could see photos of the dead, photos of the battle afterwards. In fact, his exhibition, The Dead of Antietam, was one of the most important and significant artistic contributions in the field of photography, and it is deeply saddening. It was a very, very difficult thing. It fundamentally altered the literature, the culture, the art of the nation. And one of the great things that it did psychologically to the nation is it brought about, number one, it brought about the realism period. That's not for a class not for our class, but for the next class in this sequence, the realism era. An entire generation of young men traveled and tramped around the country. They saw how big it was. They saw how diverse it was. They saw what enormous potential it had. But they also saw the blood, the horror, the inhumanity of slavery, of warfare, and they were changed as a people. They were no longer these sort of bright-eyed optimists of the Romantic era. And in fact, many of them, like William Dean Howells and Mark Twain and Henry James and all of these guys afterwards, after the war, many of them having been war correspondents themselves and seeing firsthand, eyewitness all of the horrors, went on to write a literature that was much more graphic, much more realistic, dealt less with pat moralistic, optimistic sorts of themes, and instead, a lot of the realism literature from the realism period sort of says this is how life is. Sometimes it sucks and then you die. It can be fairly bleak stuff because this war changed those young writers and had them question the optimism and the sort of the moral lessons of their youth that once they became young adults, they began to question and challenge. Maybe life isn't so great. And one of the great things was, you know, young people at the time grew up in the 19th century believing that America was a special place. God providentially had chosen us to be the birthplace of democracy and spread that democracy throughout the world. We were special. We were chosen. We were, the Pilgrims, the whole bit. We're the chosen people of the world politically to spread light and sweetness and optimism and equality. What went wrong, they asked themselves. How could this have happened? How can we explain that such a beautiful sort of garden of democracy, the land of plenty, nearly destroyed itself? How can we explain what has happened to us? That was extremely important, and for the first couple of years of the war, as it became more and more inhuman, it became more and more difficult to come to some sort of grip with why is this happening to us? What went wrong? How did we go off the rails? What does this mean? There were people who said, God is angry with us. Why? In the South they would say, why haven't we won yet? In the North they would say, why does this keep going on? And Lincoln, especially in the second inaugural, will attempt to answer that question. We'll see that, but first let's go to Whitman and take a look at one of his most probably neglected poems, I think, but also one of his best.